What if the biggest story in Washington right now isn't what politicians are talking about, but what they're suddenly releasing? Tonight, newly surfaced documents from the United States Department of Justice tied to the notorious Jeffrey Epstein case include unverified allegations involving Donald Trump. The timing is raising serious questions across the country. Why are these records appearing now, years after investigators first reviewed them? And why did officials sit on them for so long? In a nation already frustrated with political games and government secrecy, Americans want answers. Not spin, not delays, but the truth about what's in the Epstein files and who knew what. Newly surfaced records connected to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation are drawing fresh attention after documents that were not included in earlier releases suddenly appeared in a recent disclosure from the United States Department of Justice. These materials include internal summaries written by agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation describing interviews with a woman who alleged misconduct involving Epstein and Donald Trump when she was a teenager. The memos were reportedly part of the investigative record for years, but were not included when earlier batches of Epstein-related documents were made public. Their sudden appearance is now raising questions about how the files were organized, reviewed, and released to the public. To understand the significance, it's important to remember that the Epstein investigation produced thousands of pages of records tied to a global trafficking operation involving powerful figures, multiple jurisdictions, and years of legal battles. Many of those records have been released in stages following public pressure and congressional interest in transparency. However, investigators often include interview summaries that document claims without verifying them, meaning their presence in a file does not establish guilt or wrongdoing. Different media outlets are interpreting this development in noticeably different ways. Conservative-leaning coverage often emphasizes the timing of the release, asking why the documents appeared now and noting that allegations contained in interview notes are unproven and were not acted upon by investigators. Liberal-leaning coverage tends to highlight the seriousness of the accusations themselves and the broader pattern of powerful individuals connected to Epstein being scrutinized. Meanwhile, more neutral reporting focuses on the procedural questions, how the records were processed, why they were missing from earlier releases, and whether additional documents remain undisclosed. The potential consequences extend beyond one political figure. The issue touches on public trust in federal investigations, transparency in government record releases, and the ongoing debate over how the Epstein case was handled. If more documents emerge, the pressure on officials to explain the timeline and decision-making will likely intensify. The key question now is simple. Are these the final pieces of the puzzle, or just another layer of a much larger story? Let me know what you think about the timing of these releases, and stay with us as we continue to follow the next developments in this unfolding case. At the center of the newly released records are several interview summaries conducted by agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. These documents describe conversations with a woman who told investigators she was assaulted as a teenager by associates connected to the late financier Jeffrey Epstein. During multiple interviews, she expanded her claims and alleged that Donald Trump was also involved in an encounter she described. The key point here is that these are summaries of interviews, statements documented by investigators, but they remain unverified allegations. Law enforcement routinely records claims during investigations, even when they cannot be confirmed or when the statute of limitations has already expired. To understand why these documents are receiving so much attention now, it helps to remember the scale of the Epstein investigation. Over the years, authorities collected testimony from numerous individuals tied to Epstein's social and financial network. Some of those interviews were included in earlier public releases, while others remained internal until now. The presence of these particular interview summaries has sparked debate about how the files were reviewed and whether the public has seen the complete record. The way this story is being framed varies significantly across media outlets. Conservative commentators tend to emphasize that the allegations remain unproven and highlight that investigators did not pursue charges connected to these claims. From that perspective, the focus is often on questions about timing and whether political motives could influence the release of sensitive material. Liberal-leaning coverage, on the other hand, places more attention on the seriousness of the allegations themselves and the broader pattern of accusations linked to Epstein's circle of powerful associates. Meanwhile, many neutral outlets focus on the procedural aspects, how the interviews were documented, what standards investigators use when recording testimony, and why certain records are only becoming public now. The potential consequences could extend beyond political debate. Public trust in investigative transparency is at stake, and questions about the completeness of the Epstein files are unlikely to fade anytime soon. If additional records surface, the narrative around this case could shift again. So the question remains, are these interview summaries simply part of a massive investigative archive, or do they signal that more undisclosed information is still waiting to emerge? Share your perspective and stay with us as we continue to track the next developments in this evolving story. Another detail drawing intense attention comes from the language contained inside several interview summaries prepared by agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In these documents, investigators recorded the account of a woman who described explicit incidents she claims occurred years earlier involving the late financier Jeffrey Epstein, and according to her statement, an encounter she associated with Donald Trump. The memos outline the woman's description of events in considerable detail, which is why the documents are attracting so much scrutiny now that they have become public. It is important to understand what these memos actually represent. When investigators conduct interviews during large criminal inquiries, agents typically write summaries documenting what a witness claims happened. These summaries are not determinations of fact. They are records of testimony. In many cases, especially in long-running investigations like the Epstein case, agents collect information even if the claims cannot be independently verified or pursued legally. That distinction matters because the appearance of a statement in an FBI memo does not automatically establish that the events occurred as described. Still, the release of documents containing explicit allegations naturally fuels debate. Conservative commentators tend to stress that the claims were recorded but never substantiated, arguing that investigators and prosecutors did not move forward with charges tied to those specific statements. From that perspective, the emphasis is on the difference between documented accusations and proven wrongdoing. Liberal-leaning coverage, however, often highlights the seriousness of the allegations themselves and argues that detailed accounts deserve public examination, particularly within the broader context of Epstein's network and the powerful figures who moved in his social circles. Neutral outlets generally focus on the procedural dimension, how investigative memos are written, why certain passages appear unfiltered, and whether proper redactions were applied before release. The larger consequence of this debate may be the continued erosion or rebuilding of public trust in how sensitive records are handled. When documents containing serious claims emerge years later, it raises questions about transparency, investigative priorities, and the completeness of the public record. And that leaves us with a critical question moving forward. Are these newly visible details the final pieces of the Epstein archive, or just another chapter in a file that still isn't fully open to the public? Share your thoughts and stay with us as we continue monitoring the next developments. One of the most important elements in this developing story is the legal reality behind the documents. Despite the claims recorded in interview summaries, no criminal charges were ever filed related to these specific allegations. The memos prepared by investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation reflect what a witness told agents during questioning connected to the broader investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. According to those records, the woman described incidents she said happened years earlier involving Epstein and an encounter she associated with Donald Trump. However, documenting a claim and proving a crime are two very different things in the legal system. In large investigations, agents often collect testimony from many individuals, especially when trying to map out the network around a central figure like Epstein. Some statements lead to evidence and prosecutions, while others remain unverified or fall outside legal limits. In this situation, investigators recorded the allegations, but the claims did not result in charges. In part, that can happen because evidence is insufficient, witnesses cannot be corroborated, or legal deadlines, known as statutes of limitations, have already passed. That legal framework is critical for understanding why the documents exist but did not lead to a courtroom case. The media landscape shows clear differences in how this point is emphasized. Conservative outlets often focus on the absence of charges as a central fact, arguing that the legal process did not produce evidence strong enough to move forward. From that perspective, the story becomes about due process and the risk of presenting allegations without proof. Liberal-leaning coverage tends to focus more on the broader pattern of accusations tied to Epstein's world, suggesting that even uncharged claims can be relevant when evaluating the scope of his network. Meanwhile, neutral reporting usually explains the legal mechanics, how investigations gather statements, why some claims never advance to prosecution, and what standards prosecutors must meet before filing charges. The broader consequence is a debate over transparency versus fairness. Releasing investigative records may increase public awareness, but it can also blur the line between accusation and evidence. That balance matters in any democracy. So the key question remains, when previously unseen records surface years later, does it strengthen public accountability or risk reshaping the narrative without the full legal context? Let us know your perspective and stay with us as we continue tracking the next developments in this story. The response from the White House came quickly and with unmistakable clarity after the newly released documents began circulating. Officials strongly rejected the allegations contained in interview summaries tied to the investigation surrounding Jeffrey Epstein. Representatives for Donald Trump stated that the claims are completely unfounded and not supported by credible evidence. Their position is that the documents reflect accusations recorded during interviews, but do not represent verified facts or findings from prosecutors. From the administration's perspective, the release of these materials does not change the legal reality that no charges were filed and no case was brought forward related to the claims described in the memos compiled by agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. To understand the intensity of the response, it helps to consider the broader political and legal environment surrounding the Epstein investigation. The case has been under public scrutiny for years, not only because of Epstein's crimes, but also because of the powerful individuals who appeared in his social network. Whenever new documents emerge, even investigative notes or interview summaries, they quickly become part of the national political conversation. That makes the official response from the White House particularly significant because it shapes how supporters, critics, and the broader public interpret the material. Media coverage of the response reveals distinct narrative differences. Conservative outlets often highlight the firm denial from the administration and emphasize the lack of evidence supporting the accusations. Their focus tends to be on due process and the argument that releasing unverified allegations can create misleading impressions. Liberal-leaning outlets typically give more attention to the substance of the allegations themselves and the need for transparency surrounding figures connected to Epstein. Neutral reporting generally presents both elements side by side, documenting the claims contained in the interview records while also noting the administration's categorical denial and the absence of legal action. The consequences of this exchange may extend beyond the immediate controversy. Public trust in institutions, whether political leadership or investigative agencies, often hinges on how clearly and consistently information is presented. So the question going forward is straightforward but important. Will additional documents clarify the story, or will the debate continue to revolve around competing interpretations of the same records? Share your perspective and stay tuned as we continue following the next developments. As these documents began circulating, one question quickly moved to the center of the conversation. Why are these records appearing now? The materials released through the United States Department of Justice include interview summaries prepared by agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation during the long-running investigation connected to Jeffrey Epstein. According to reporting surrounding the disclosure, these memos had existed within investigative files for years, but were not included in earlier batches of documents that were made public. Their delayed appearance is what's raising questions among lawmakers, journalists, and the public. To understand the concern, it helps to look at the history of the Epstein records. The investigation generated thousands of pages of documents over more than a decade, including witness interviews, evidence logs, and internal summaries. When portions of these files began to be released to the public, they were often redacted or distributed in stages due to privacy concerns, legal restrictions, and ongoing reviews. That process, while common in large federal investigations, can also create confusion when new pieces of information surface later and appear to change the narrative. Different media outlets are interpreting the timing in very different ways. Conservative commentary often focuses on the possibility that the delayed release could be politically motivated, particularly because the documents mention Donald Trump. From that perspective, the central issue becomes whether the timing of the disclosure could influence political debate rather than simply reflect routine archival processing. Liberal-leaning coverage tends to frame the timing as evidence that important records connected to Epstein's network may still be emerging, reinforcing calls for broader transparency and complete disclosure of all remaining files. Neutral reporting typically concentrates on procedural explanations: how large investigative archives are reviewed, why documents can be withheld during earlier releases, and whether additional files are still under examination. The broader consequence of this debate is the growing pressure on institutions to explain exactly how and when records are made public. In cases involving high-profile figures and historic investigations, even routine administrative steps can quickly become political flashpoints. So the key issue now isn't just what the documents say, it's why they are appearing at this particular moment. Do these releases reflect the normal pace of document review? Or is there more to the timeline than we currently understand? Let us know what you think, and stay with us as we continue following the next update in this developing story. The latest release of documents connected to the investigation of Jeffrey Epstein has quickly evolved into a broader political fight over transparency. Lawmakers in Washington are now debating how much information tied to the Epstein case should be made public and whether federal agencies have fully complied with demands for disclosure. Members of the United States House Committee on Oversight and Accountability have pushed for more access to the investigative archive, arguing that the public deserves a clear picture of how authorities handled one of the most controversial criminal cases in recent memory. The issue has been building for years. Epstein's network reportedly included powerful individuals across business, politics, and international circles, which intensified calls for accountability after his arrest and death in 2019. Since then, thousands of pages of records have surfaced through court proceedings, investigative releases, and congressional inquiries. Yet critics from both political parties say the picture is still incomplete. That's why lawmakers are demanding explanations from officials at the United States Department of Justice about how documents are reviewed, redacted, and ultimately released to the public. The media landscape shows clear differences in how this dispute is framed. Conservative outlets often emphasize concerns that selective document releases could unfairly target certain political figures, particularly because some interview summaries mention Donald Trump, while other parts of Epstein's network remain less scrutinized. From that viewpoint, the debate centers on whether transparency is being applied evenly. Liberal-leaning coverage typically focuses on the importance of exposing the full scope of Epstein's connections, arguing that powerful individuals should not be shielded from public examination. Neutral reporting tends to focus on institutional accountability, explaining how congressional oversight works and why lawmakers frequently clash with federal agencies over access to investigative records. The potential consequences of this political standoff are significant. If Congress concludes that information was withheld or released inconsistently, it could lead to further hearings, subpoenas, or new legislation aimed at tightening transparency rules for federal investigations. And that brings us to the central question moving forward. Will this push for transparency finally produce a complete public record of the Epstein investigation, or will the debate over what remains hidden continue? Share your perspective and stay with us as we follow the next developments in this ongoing story. The political pressures surrounding the Epstein records reached a new level when lawmakers moved to formally subpoena the nation's top law enforcement official. Members of the United States House Committee on Oversight and Accountability voted to compel testimony from Pam Bondi regarding how the Justice Department handled the review and public release of documents tied to the investigation of Jeffrey Epstein. The subpoena is part of a broader effort by Congress to understand why some materials surfaced only recently and whether the process used to redact and publish those records followed proper standards. This step is significant because subpoenas are one of the strongest oversight tools available to Congress. Lawmakers typically use them when they believe voluntary cooperation has not provided enough clarity. In this case, the focus is not only on what the documents contain, but also on the procedures behind the scenes, how files were reviewed, why certain details were initially withheld, and whether sensitive information related to victims was handled correctly. The controversy intensified after newly released records included interview summaries mentioning Donald Trump, even though the allegations referenced in those documents remain unverified and did not result in charges. Media coverage of the subpoena highlights clear narrative differences. Conservative outlets often frame the move as part of a broader demand for accountability from federal agencies, arguing that lawmakers are right to question how and why certain records were released when they were. In that interpretation, the focus is on government transparency and whether investigative files have been handled consistently. Liberal-leaning coverage tends to emphasize Congress's responsibility to investigate the handling of the Epstein case more broadly, including whether officials properly managed evidence connected to influential individuals within Epstein's social circle. Neutral reporting generally centers on the mechanics of congressional oversight, explaining how subpoenas work and why committees sometimes compel testimony from executive branch officials. The potential consequences could extend beyond this specific dispute. If Congress determines that the document release process was flawed, it could lead to additional hearings, stricter transparency requirements, or further investigations into the handling of the Epstein case. So the real question now becomes this: when the Attorney General eventually answers questions under oath, will lawmakers finally get a clear explanation, or will the controversy surrounding these files grow even deeper? Share your thoughts and stay with us as we continue following the next developments in this unfolding story. As the debate over newly released documents continues, another voice remains central to the conversation: the survivors. Individuals who say they were harmed by the network surrounding Jeffrey Epstein are continuing to demand answers about how the case was handled and why certain records are only now becoming public. Among those speaking out is Annie Farmer, who has long argued that transparency is critical not only for justice, but also for restoring trust in the system that was supposed to protect victims. For many survivors, the issue goes beyond a single allegation or a single name. Their concern centers on the broader investigation into Epstein's activities and the network of influential people who moved within his orbit. Over the years, portions of investigative records have been released through court proceedings and government disclosures, but survivors and their advocates say the picture still feels incomplete. They argue that the public deserves to understand how decisions were made by authorities and whether opportunities for accountability were missed. The way media outlets frame this part of the story varies widely. Conservative commentary often stresses the importance of protecting due process, emphasizing that allegations recorded in investigative documents, some referencing figures such as Donald Trump, must be carefully distinguished from proven facts. From that viewpoint, the focus is on ensuring that calls for accountability do not bypass legal standards. Liberal-leaning coverage tends to highlight the voices of survivors more prominently, arguing that their experiences should remain at the center of public discussion and that transparency is essential to uncovering the full scope of Epstein's operations. Neutral reporting typically presents both dynamics, noting survivors' demands for answers while also explaining the legal complexities that often limit how far investigations can go. The broader consequence of this debate could shape how future cases involving powerful figures are handled. Public pressure from survivors has already influenced reforms in victim advocacy and investigative transparency in several high-profile cases. So the larger question moving forward is this: will the continued push from survivors lead to deeper scrutiny and fuller disclosure of the Epstein investigation, or will the case remain a patchwork of partial revelations? Share your thoughts and stay with us as we continue tracking the next developments in this ongoing story. The latest document releases are not only sparking debate about individual allegations, they are also reviving broader questions about the full scope of the network surrounding Jeffrey Epstein. For years, investigators, journalists, and lawmakers have tried to understand how Epstein was able to maintain relationships with influential figures across business, politics, and international circles. Each new batch of records, including interview summaries and investigative notes from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, tends to reopen the same central question: how extensive was Epstein's circle, and how much of that story has actually been revealed to the public? The background to this debate stretches back decades. Epstein built connections with prominent individuals through financial ventures, philanthropy, and social events. After his arrest and the exposure of his trafficking operation, scrutiny expanded beyond his crimes to examine whether others in his orbit had knowledge of or involvement in illegal activity. Some names appeared in flight logs, contact lists, or social records, but being associated with Epstein socially does not necessarily imply wrongdoing, and investigators have repeatedly emphasized that many individuals mentioned in documents were never accused of criminal conduct. That distinction remains central as new materials referencing figures such as Donald Trump continue to surface in interview records. Media outlets frame the broader network question in noticeably different ways. Conservative commentary often stresses that appearing in Epstein-related documents should not automatically be interpreted as evidence of misconduct. From that perspective, the focus is on preventing guilt by association and ensuring that allegations are backed by verifiable proof. Liberal-leaning coverage tends to emphasize the importance of mapping Epstein's entire circle, arguing that transparency is essential to understanding how he operated and whether powerful connections shielded aspects of his activities. Neutral reporting typically concentrates on the investigative process itself, how authorities analyze networks, why certain records become public, and how the distinction between association and criminal involvement is maintained. The potential consequences of this debate are significant. If additional records reveal new connections or unanswered questions, the pressure for deeper investigations could grow, both in Congress and within law enforcement. And that leaves us with a critical point to consider. Are we finally approaching the full picture of Epstein's network, or are there still chapters of this story that remain hidden in unreleased files? Let us know what you think. And stay with us as we continue following the next developments in this evolving case.